Today I want to talk about Rogue and how I beat insane roguelike difficulty with it. In the first part of the video, I'll go over all the Rogue talents, and in the second one, I'll show you the character that I beat the game with and talk you through leveling, Prodigy's gear, and the many mistakes I made. Rogue is one of the default classes in the base game, and at first glance, it's exactly what you'd expect. A dual-wielding, nimble, melee weapon class. And while you can definitely play it that way, it even has a unique tree that supports that playstyle. For me, Rogue is actually a throwing knife class, which is a special weapon type you can only play on Rogue and Marauder, but Marauder has a lower mastery for it, so it's basically Rogue's special thing. I will mostly be looking at the talents from that perspective. So let's get into the throwing knives tree first, so that I can sell you on it. Once you put your first point here, you will get a talent that allows you to throw a knife. Sounds simple, right? Well, it differs from your normal weapons in a few ways that are absolutely crucial to understand. Number 1. Throwing knives are completely separated from the actual weapons in your hands. You could wield a two-handed hammer that does 1000 damage, or a training sword that does 1 damage. Throwing knives would still perform the exact same. What this means is that your weapons just become stat sticks, and this gives you wild possibilities. A staff, a mind star, a mace, and a dagger can all be equally viable depending on what kind of stats they roll. Which brings me to my next point. Throwing knives count as melee attacks for the purpose of on-hit effects. Most of the time. This is easiest to show on an example, so let's look at this dagger. It's easy to assume that if you equip Cloud Typhoon, your throwing knives will burn arcane resources and deal extra 20 acid and 11 darkness damage on hit. But this is not the case. For the purpose of throwing knives, it is safe to ignore any text on weapons above the When Wielded Worn label, as it will have no effect. Those stats are directly tied to attacks with that specific weapon, and when you throw a knife, that is not that weapon. The on-hit melee effects that do count for throwing knives are the ones everywhere else. For example, on this leather armor, you have effects on melee hit, 10% chance to slow global speed, and this you can apply with your knives. Same here for the Summertide Vial. If you equip it, you would get plus 15 light damage on your knives. And for a final weapon example, equipping this would only give you the constitution and willpower, the acid damage and penetration, and a bit of life. The base power, armor penetration, or crit chance values of the weapon are all also irrelevant. Number 3. All the relevant stats for throwing knives are shown in the talent menu, not in the character sheet. You can see here I only have 77 accuracy for my weapons, but if I look at throwing knives, I'll see that for them I actually have 93 accuracy. There will also be differences for crit chance, armor pen, and damage numbers, as these just scale differently for the knives, so this is where you want to check it. Number 4. Changes to attack speed do not apply to throwing knives. You can easily check this by looking at the talent's usage speed, then using a talent like Blade Flurry to increase your attack speed, and then checking that unlike Dual Strike's usage speed, throwing knives does not change. I don't really get why this is how it works, but it does. And it unfortunately took me until I put 5 points into Blade Flurry to realize this. That's it for the weird mechanics, so how does it play? Throwing knives are the reason I put Rogue into B tier on my class tier list, and it has exceeded my expectations. This tree is pretty nuts. The scaling says 50% strength, but that gets converted to Cunning through Lethality, so it uses 120% of the perfect stats, so it deals excellent damage all throughout the game. The only noticeable downside is that you only get 10 knives, and then you need to slowly reload, so it's good to either have a plan B, like investing into a few melee skills, or a movement infusion so that you can quickly reload. Fan of knives is the most terrifying sound you can hear in Tome, and it feels damn good to be on the side that's causing it instead of receiving it. Its best use is as a big burst of single target damage, although you can always use it for AoE too. What is important to notice here is that an enemy can only be hit by 5 knives. Makes sense, sounds like a good way to balance it. But as I was playing the character, I realized sometimes my knives are just disappearing. They don't hit, they don't miss, they just vanish. Well, it took me until level 46 to put 2 and 2 together, but this is why that happens. Each target can get hit up to 5 times is not tied to Fan of Knives, but to all the knives. And it's not per cast, but per turn. This means if you have high action speed and you follow up your Fan of Knives with any other throwing knife attack, it will simply disappear, because that enemy has already been hit 5 times by the Fan of Knives. Without add-ons, I don't believe it's possible to see what turn you are in, so you end up having to guess. For my character, just to be safe, I just ended up always following up Fan of Knives with a non-knife action, like a psionic shield or a trap, and that seemed to work for the most part, although I would still usually follow up with a basic attack, just because I didn't want my other strong knife attacks to just disappear, so hopefully this saves you some confusion. Also, this breaks stealth, which will become relevant. Precise aim passively gives you crit chance and multi, which is nice, but more importantly, up to 45% chance to disarm, silence, or pin enemies on crit, which I don't think checks saves. These are all really good debuffs, and if you attack while hidden in stealth, you always crit. So this talent alone can win you fights where you just keep an enemy permanently disabled. Quick Draw is how you actually get attack speed with throwing knives, since the regular attack speed doesn't apply. It's good and should be maxed. I don't think the second ability about melee is very important. Dual Techniques is the basic dual wielding tree if you want to go melee or run out of knives. It has dual strike to stun, and it importantly applies it through accuracy, not physical power, which is much better since you're not taking strength. Flurry hits 6 times in a single action, which works very well with on-hit effects and generally does insane damage. This is one of the best weapon talents in the game. Heartseeker is a decent attack time to mobility, which makes it an extremely useful talent, and Whirlwind is a bit of AoE that is again more useful for the mobility, but here you can only get it up to 3 range. Moving on to Duelist, Dual Weapon Mastery reduces your offhand damage penalty, which is only relevant if you attack with it, which throwing knives don't. But then it gives you the ability to parry weapon attacks, which reduces their damage like armor, and prevents critical strikes. That is definitely worth a point or two, as unexpected crits are often what kills you. Tempo passively gives tiny bonuses sometimes, and I wouldn't ever put more than a single point in it. Feint is mostly useful for getting out of being surrounded, but Rogue already has other great ways to jump over enemies that don't require to be in melee, so it's not too great. Lunge is a strong offhand attack that disarms your enemy for a very long time, which makes anything melee that is not called Brawler completely useless. One of the best talents for melee rogues. Now we get to Stealth, and unlike Shadowblade who wanted to leave Stealth, on Rogue you can actually stay in it permanently. Stealth is either the best defensive layer in the game, since enemies won't see you and they'll walk around aimlessly, or it's completely useless, as they lock onto you and simply ignore the fact that you are in stealth. For the most part though, it is pretty powerful. It scales with Cunning, and if you max the talent early and invest into Cunning, you will be consistently beating the stealth checks of most enemies. The best part is, even if an enemy does spot you, they can lose track of you again, so melee enemies will dash towards you, only to walk back while you are peppering them with throwing knives, which, unlike melee attacks, do not break stealth. The last part of this talent is that you'll have 0 light radius, so you need to rely on infravision or heightened senses, as it's called in the character sheet, which only shows enemies but not your surroundings. For the most part, it's almost as good as light radius, so this is fine. Shadow Strike automatically gives you crits when enemies don't see you before you strike. With throwing knives, this basically reads all your attacks are crits. That's pretty good. Soothing Darkness gives you an almost unnoticeable life and stamina regen in stealth, and then multiplies it by 5 after leaving it. I don't think this is very good on Rogue. Even the melee build has some synergies with entering and quitting out of stealth constantly, and when that happens, you don't keep the regen. I think I said that in the last video, that you can use Shadow Dance and refresh the regen, but that's not how it works. If you are in stealth, you get the small regen. When you are not in stealth, you get the multiplied regen. Shadow Dance lets you stay in stealth while using stealth-breaking talents. Notable examples are some runes like Rune of Dissipation, Fan of Knives, or Flurry, and then tools like the Psionic Shield Torque. So this is absolutely key to the stealth playstyle, and every extra turn feels great on this talent, so don't be afraid to max it eventually. Trapping. Now, I did not think I would like this tree, and I don't, as long as it behaves like traps. You can only prepare one trap out of a bunch of default ones, and you can learn new traps as you disarm them out in the world, and there are all kinds of them, doing different damage types, AoE, single target, ones that disarm or silence, whatever debuff you can think of. So you will find one that fits your build, but the problem is you need to put them down and then have enemies step on them. And this just doesn't play out too well. Sometimes the enemies don't want to cooperate and walk to a different square, especially if you are stealthed. This is a problem. Or they could even jump over your trap in some way. So I do not like this very much. But it gets better. Lure is a target dummy. Despite what it says, it is extremely squishy, so you can't really use it to tank, but you use it to lure enemies. It is your best talent to pull them from around the corner. But since the taunt range is pretty small with few points, and it also blocks your knives, it's usually not very useful once you are in combat. Advanced Trap Deployment gives you attack speed for traps and lets you place them further away, which is very useful and makes it not feel as bad, and it's especially good for trap priming, which makes a chosen trap become primed, so that it instantly triggers when placed, making it function like a normal talent. And most of these are pretty good, so it's worth the points to get here. If you go for nature damage, Poison Gas Trap is great, as it applies some of the poisons that you don't use, and if you stick with just physical, you have Flashbang or Spring Razor. With a bit of investment and the mystical Cunning Prodigy, this will also never break stealth. And now, the last piece of the puzzle, poisons. If you don't see this tree on your rogue, it's because it needs to be unlocked by siding with the Assassin Lord on any character ever. And you meet the Assassin Lord around level 20. And until rogue, I always saw poisons as a great, cheap way to just apply a few extra strong debuffs. But what if you want poisons to be your primary damage source? Can that work? For the long version, you'll need to watch the guide, but in short, yeah, but you need to pay a high price for it, an entire Prodigy. Without Mystical Cunning, I wouldn't bother, because you will just never kill poison immune enemies. And there are a decent amount of them out there. Toxic Death spreads your poisons when an enemy dies, and it feels incredible. It can cause some big chain reactions and just improves your clear speed. It's useful in situations like entrances to Orc Prides, to clean up the trash monsters, but I think mostly it just makes fights that you would win anyways a bit faster. Still, I think it's worth 2 points. Vile Poisons. So usually here you would go Numbing Poison to reduce enemy damage, and Crippling Poison to make enemies fail their talents. That combo is just perfect. But if you want your poison to really deal damage, you have to sacrifice one of them for Volatile Poison, which makes the poison hit harder and even in an AoE. You also have Insidious, which reduces healing, and Leeching, which heals you for a percentage of the poison's damage. These, especially Insidious, can be situationally very useful. Venomous Strike or Venomous Throw, since you get a ranged version of this talent if you know throwing knives, has different effects based on the active vile poisons. And when I say active, I mean the currently sustained vile poisons. The enemy does not actually need to be poisoned to apply these effects, which is how I assumed this worked for a long time. You can open with this talent and it will still apply the effects. And the slow is the best one, which is why I think you should sacrifice Crippling if you focus on nature damage. Other than that, this does a ton of weapon damage as nature, and it ends up being stronger than the actual poison. It gets to the point where it can just one-shot rares. So you get really powerful debuffs with a super powerful attack, so this talent is absolutely incredible. Dirty Fighting is the debuff tree. The talent reduces enemy immunities, mainly relevant for stun, but since some of the enemies that have stun immunity will have even like 160% stun immunity, at least on insane difficulty, this talent is pretty useless from my experience. Backstab increases your damage per debuff on the enemy, which also works on poisons, and it gives you a small chance to apply some extra debuffs on your melee attacks, which works on throwing knives. So it works great with that, but I think this is generally good for any rogue build. Blinding Powder blinds in a small cone. Blind is a good debuff, but it's not good enough to spend a whole turn just to apply it in basically melee range, so I don't like this talent. Twist the Knife prolongs debuffs on the target while shortening the same amount of buffs. This sounds really good in theory, and there are a few niche uses for it, like getting rid of evasion on enemies, but if you go melee, most fights will be over before you'd have a reason to use this, and with throwing knives, you are too far to use it. So despite it looking pretty powerful, I've not been too impressed with this talent. For the locked trees, there is the very common combat techniques, but there's a little surprise. Rush is a good gap closer, and while it breaks stealth, you can use this with Shadow Dance after you run out of knives to continue dishing out damage while being hidden. Precise Strikes, I just now realized as I'm writing down my thoughts, is insanely good with throwing knives because they do not get affected by the general attack speed. So if you only throw knives, this is a pure upside sustain. I just now tested it in game, and yeah, I probably should have figured this out as I was playing my character and not after, but at the same time, you don't really need accuracy or crit chance for throwing knives. I don't think the knives have a bonus for excess accuracy, the tooltip doesn't say so, and you always crit from stealth, but it's good to know this is how it works. Perfect Strike is a great niche talent to boost your accuracy, and I also use it when I get blinded, so I can hit the enemies that I can't see without the penalty, but I am not actually sure if that works, because I think that's meant for hitting invisible or stealthed enemies, so it's very possible I'm just wrong. And Blinding Speed gives you global speed at instant speed, and as you probably know by now, acting more often is good. The other two trees are unique to Rogue. Assassination is more for the melee rogues. It starts with Coup de Grace, and it's just a big attack that can even insta-kill low enemies by checking your accuracy against their physical save, which, if successful, also puts you in stealth. This is a solid finisher. Terrorize is a passive more about this theme of popping in and out of stealth, so when you reveal yourself, you will apply a powerful debuff to surrounding enemies through your accuracy. With talents like the previous talent or Shadow Dance, you could do this multiple times in a fight, so this is pretty good. Just in case you didn't have enough debuffs, Garrote lets you silence when attacking from stealth. That's good, but even better is the extra unarmed attack per turn you get. This screams go flexible combat, equip some gloves with procs that give you extra attacks, and just annihilate anything that can't get away from you. Because this is a range of 1, this does not work with throwing knives, unless you stand next to the enemy, at which point it does, but unfortunately the unarmed attack will cancel your stealth, so there is some anti-synergy here. Marked for Death is a boss killer. It amplifies all damage you deal, and then deals a percentage of it after 4 turns. Unfortunately, it's not instant, although the use speed is a weapon, so attack speed will affect it. Still, for this to be worth it, the enemy needs to survive for at least 3 more attacks, which, once your character is online, will happen pretty rarely. You also ideally want to apply a stun, disarm or silence as your first action, instead of doing nothing. So it's probably worth it on the toughest enemies, but I don't think it's quite as good as it seems. Artifice lets you engineer up a few tools. The first 3 talents are the same. They each let you prepare either the grappling hook, useful for getting casters close to you, Rogue's Brew, which gives you back HP, stamina, and even cleanses physical effects, so this is like a really good inscription, but it takes a turn to use, Dart Launcher, which I think is the weakest of these, as it just puts a single target to sleep, Smokescreen, which blocks sight, and the Hidden Blades, which I think is the best, as it gives you an extra unarmed attack on melee crits, and while it has a 4-turn cooldown, it's all about that initial burst of damage. So you get to pick 3 out of these, and then with Master Artificer, you get to upgrade one of the ones you've already prepared. Out of these, I like Smokescreen, if you need the silence, or Hidden Blades for more damage, and you even get an extra unarmed attack talent, which ignores armor and resistances. I like that a lot. The slow on the Dart Launcher is good, but you already get that from Venomous Strike. Grappling Hook just seems worse than the Hidden Blades upgrade, and for Rogue's Brew, I don't value temporary negative HP increases much. You want the temporary HP at the start. This is why I'd much rather have a Shield Rune for like 300 than a Heroism Infusion for 700, because you can't safely stay in the fight once all your real HP is gone anyways. On the generic side, there is not much going on. There is the amazing mobility tree. Disengage is better feint, allowing you to jump over multiple enemies even, but they need to be lined up. This also breaks stealth. Evasion, instant speed gives you survivability against melee enemies, and it's pretty good even for a single point. Tumble is approaching movement infusion level admiration for me. It's basically an instant speed, short range teleport with a short cooldown, and it has saved my life countless of times. Excellent at 3 range and godlike at 4 range. It's just so good. Trained Reactions reduces damage from big hits at the cost of stamina, and it's up there with the best defensive sustains in Tome. From around level 25-ish, you should be able to run this without stamina problems. As for Lethality, it passively gives you crit chance and crit multi, and makes your daggers, or knives, use Cunning instead of Strength. It doesn't give a lot for more points though. Expose Weakness will help you get through high armor enemies on melee rogue. For throwing knives, I wouldn't bother. The passive armor penetration is really tiny. Blade Flurry is an amazing sustain that gives a lot of attack speed if you can deal with the stamina degen, which should only be a problem early on in the game. Importantly, it does not affect throwing knives or traps, so for a build purely focusing on that, it is not good. But if you do any kind of melee, it's crazy powerful. Snap resets your cooldowns, letting you use your best talents twice. Fortunately, it costs a turn, but it's still very much worth it for your flurry, fan of knives, stuff like that. It does break stealth though. In the common survival, you always want track to see scary enemies before they see you, and the device mastery can be good to use your active items more often. The locked category is Scoundrel. Lacerating Strikes gives you a percentage chance to double your attack's damage in the form of a bleed over 4 turns. This is decent, as some extra damage in the background, but I wouldn't put more than 2-3 points in it. Scoundrel Strategies passively makes you apply a debuff on attacks that reduces crit multiplier. I like this a lot, since crits are the most dangerous. You could even end up maxing this if you have some leftover points. The part about making enemies forget a talent is basically useless. It would be cool if it told you which talent it put on cooldown, so maybe you could play around that information, but I don't think currently there's a way to know that. Misdirection makes you immune to all physical effects, 35% of the time, at best. That is still nice. Disarm, Blind, Pin, and some dot effects are all physical debuffs that you likely won't be immune to, and you might have to cleanse. So this could be saving you an inscription. You also get some pretty significant defense on top of that, which will always be relevant since you will be using light armor, because some of the talents like trained reactions require it. And Fumble gives your attacks a stacking chance for an enemy to fail using their talent. Enemies skipping their turn is really good, and this has no cooldown. I think 2-3 points are the sweet spot, although with talents like Flurry and Fan of Knives, you could stack this up really quickly to the higher percentage, but I don't think it's a high priority to ever put more than 3 points here. So here's my guy, straight from the final boss, and I have to address my character name, which is Shadowblade, and I thought it's hilarious because my last character was the class Shadowblade, but I spent all my time outside of stealth But now that I'm playing a rogue, I spent all my time in stealth and I am throwing blades, so Shadow Blade. Haha, very funny. But it has already confused me a few times, and especially when making a video about it, might not have been the smartest decision. But yeah, despite the name, this is Rogue. For transparency's sake, these are the add-ons that I use. None of them affect gameplay, and you can definitely just play vanilla. None of these are needed to play the game. So, let's talk about what this build is. I came into it wanting to combine 3 mechanics that I have not interacted with really in all my time playing Tome. Stealth, throwing knives, and poison as your main damage source. And traps a little bit. They are not the main focus of this build, but still pretty useful, and I've never used them before. And the build successfully combines all these things into a character that works, and I beat the game with it. But here's what the character isn't. I don't think it's the strongest rogue build you can make, and it's probably not even the strongest throwing knife build you can make. I think if you just purely focus on physical damage, and you save all these points into the poison talents, and you pick up some of these melee talents so that after you run out of knives, you can jump into melee and just do only physical damage, I would assume that character would be better. I'll even show you roughly how I would build that character. I would go Shalor and skip combat techniques, and instead take Assassination and Artifice, and try to combine those playstyles of being in stealth, throwing knives, and then once you go into melee, you maybe leave stealth for a while, and then re-enter it through Shadow Dance or Coup de Grace. And on the Artifice I would use Rogue's Brew in the one talent that I have 2 points in, so that it cleanses 2 negative effects. And as an upgrade I would use the Hidden Blades Assassinate for more damage and getting the extra talent. And for Prodigies you could go Flexible Combat into Arcane Might, and you would go Magic as your third stat, which should apply to the throwing knives, I assume. And yeah, this build feels like you would just do so much damage, and the gearing would be a lot easier since you just take physical, which is very common on items. So that's how I imagine that. But now let's get back to the poison build, which is not bad by any stretch. It's just that the biggest problem is a non-obvious one, and that's gear. Specifically, nature damage penetration. That is a item modifier that is fairly rare on gear. Nature damage you will find, but nature resistance penetration, when it is found, is sometimes an anti-magic ego, which you could go anti-magic rogue, but it's not ideal. So that ends up being the biggest bottleneck, is just finding nature penetration. I struggled so much in the latter part of the game, because I had like 37 nature penetration, and I couldn't kill the Guardians. Once I came from the east, I struggled to kill the Guardians. That has never happened to me. And for a while, I thought that the character is just doomed. I just won't be able to finish the game. But then thankfully, I got to edit my items a little bit through the Font of Sacrifice, and I got some nature penetration, and I was able to kill the Guardians. And once I did get to 70% nature penetration, and the build felt pretty good. It didn't feel any less powerful than the other builds that get to the late game. But it's good to keep this in mind. As you go throughout the game, nature penetration is king. Any item that has it, basically you rely on the random power that is on the item to be nature penetration. So I'll show you these gloves. These only have a single ego meaning item modifier, and that's the nature item modifier, which gives nature damage and nature resist. And as one of the random powers, it rolled 25% resistance penetration. So these are just incredible. 25% resistance penetration is a lot, and I just couldn't find it anywhere else. But I'm skipping a bit ahead. We'll talk more about the items later. I just want to point this out as what I perceive to be the biggest weakness of this character, the resistance penetration. I again uploaded my playthrough of High Peak and the final boss as just pure gameplay without commentary, if you want to see how the class plays, or how I dealt with the final boss, which ended up being pretty close, and I was beginning that cycle or spiral of getting constantly debuffed once you run out of all your cleanses, which is a sign you are going to die within the next 5 to 10 turns, but thankfully I already had enough poison damage that I managed to finish the boss. and I still had Blood of Life, so it wasn't that close, but it was closer than some of the other builds. For my race, I started with Cornac originally, and I wanted to take Artifice or Assassination for the Marked for Death, but I died pretty early on, at around level 15, and it didn't feel quite right, so I went back to one of my favorites, Drem. This is obviously a DLC class from the Forbidden Cults, and it is not the easiest to unlock, but don't worry if you don't have it. This is not really necessary for this build. You could definitely go Shalor and skip combat techniques for Artifice or Assassination, since you would get global speed from the Shalor talent. You could go Doom Elf. All the races that are always decent will be decent here as well. But Drem is nice because of Frenzy, that lets you reset the talent cooldown on your class talents. So this lets me use Venomous Strike, Fan of Knives, twice at the beginning of each fight, which is a lot of extra damage. Now you can do this without going Drem, if you go Snap, which you should take even if you do go Drem, but since I wasted 5 points on Blade Flurry, I ended up not having enough points for Snap. So Drem is just because I really like playing the race, but it's not key to the build. For the stats, you would think you max Cunning first, because that's what scales your stealth and poison, but I found the best way to play this character is to ignore poisons until after your first Prodigy, where you pick up Mystical Cunning. Until then, you just focus on physical damage and let Throwing Knives carry you. And since Throwing Knives scale with Dexterity 20% more than Cunning, just max Dexterity first, and then Cunning second. Third, since I don't really need weapon damage, as the plan is for the poisons to do all the work, even though it's not really true since the knives still do a lot of damage, and I use Venomous Strike, I just decided to go into Constitution to get a lot of extra life, since sometimes the fights take longer than on other builds, since you need a turn or two to make the poisons do the damage. So this gives you some extra life to work with. And then the last points I just put into Willpower to get some extra stamina, just to make sure you never struggle with this, because you always want to have the option to use Stumble, and you always want some stamina so that trained reactions can work. So being on low stamina on these like rogue classes that have mobility is really bad. For the leveling, as I mentioned, you ignore poisons for the most part and just focus on the Throwing Knives and physical damage and stealth. I only did 3 points in poisons early, just so you get the numbing poison, and then you would need 2 points for the crippling poison, which is the other good poison, as long as you use poison just as a debuff, and that just felt like too high of an investment, so that's why I kept it at a single point for a while. And for traps, I did put 2 points into the category for lure early on, but I'm not sure it's all that worth it. You should experiment with it. Sometimes it's nice, but I think it's okay waiting with it until later on in the game. And then past the first Prodigy, you max out all your poison talents, you eventually get to Dirty Fighting, which gives you a bit more damage and more debuffs. And you also get into traps, since by that point you should be able to use Poison Gas Trap, which is the ideal talent to use after Fan of Knives, since you can't use a knife attack after Fan of Knives, otherwise it disappears. Poison Gas Trap just fits into that gap perfectly. On the generic side, you want to max out Dagger Master as fast as possible, since this applies to the knives, and it just increases the damage. 5 points in Thick Skin, as all resistance is absolutely key to surviving. Only 2 points in combat accuracy, you could probably even get away with 0. Right now I have 96 accuracy, and this is with basically no accuracy on my gear. You always want 1 point in heavy armor training so that you can use gauntlets, heavy helms, heavy boots, stuff like that. Do not put 5 points into Blade Flurry, as you will never be using it if you decide to just ignore the melee attacks. Blade Flurry is useless, it does not affect Throwing Knives, it does not affect traps. Well, it actually might affect Lure, since it uses combat. Let's have a look. Blade Flurry is on. Okay, so it does affect Lure, and it also affects Venomous Strike. So I actually just... why did I use it exactly? I had the stamina regen for it, so I definitely could have run it. Well, I don't know, but for these 2 talents, since Lure you will usually use not in combat, so you don't need speed for it. And Venomous Strike you will obviously use in combat, but I wouldn't invest 4 extra points here just to throw this a little faster. You could put these points into Snap, or into some of these Scoundrel talents. The Drem's third talent, Faceless. These kinds of talents, you should only invest as many points as are necessary. it's ideal to float points in these talents so that you can always take them away, since you might max this, since you will need it in the early game, but later on you will find a ring that gives you 60% confusion immunity, and then you will have 20% confusion immunity extra, so ideally you should keep these points flexible. I briefly mentioned Antimagic, and it's actually an interesting option, since after Dexterity and Cunning, you could just max Willpower and go Antimagic. Maybe that's what I would do with the core neck. You would take Combat Techniques, and Scoundrel, and Fungus from the Antimagic tree, and you would have more points so that you could make that happen. So that's an interesting option. For the Prodigies, you don't have much choice for your first Prodigy. It needs to be Mystical Cunning, and you need 50 magic for it. This means you need to save up plus 40 magic on your gear, then put it all on, reach 50 magic, take Mystical Cunning, and then you can sell all the magic gear, put back on your normal gear, and you will keep this Prodigy. And you might not be able to do this right on level 25. I think it took me until level 27 until I found enough gear. And that's okay, since still between level 25 to 30 you are kind of transitioning from physical damage to the poison build, so that's okay. As for what it actually does, it gives you mastery in poison and trapping, so it just makes them better across the board. Reduces Venomous Strike cooldown, which is basically your best talent. Reduces Lure cooldown, which is not very useful. And gives you Vulnerability Poison, which I thought what it means is that it would be one of the poisons you get with Vile Poisons. So I would have to, now instead of Numbing for example, I would take the Vulnerability Poison. But thankfully, this just applies to all your attacks. Well, not all your attacks. Any attack that apply poison. So 62% chance to apply. So it's basically passive. So that is very nice and makes it a lot better than I thought. It does some arcane damage, which will always be pretty low since you don't take magic. But it reduces all damage resistance by 10%. So it's just a small damage multiplier. And obviously reduces the poison immunity, so that you can poison even undead creatures. Fighting poison immune enemies still sucks, really bad, but at least it's manageable. It also gives you Gravitic Trap, which I didn't think much of, but it's alright. It deals some temporal damage, which is whatever, but it constantly pulls enemies towards it, so if you use it smartly, it can keep pulling melee enemies away from you, which is very useful. Enemies also don't have to step on it to trigger it, they just need to be near it, which makes a big difference. Now for a second Prodigy, I was looking for something defensive, and since this build is all about really committing to these weird mechanics like stealth, I gravitated towards Armour of Shadows, which just increases your stealth rating by 30, which is a decent amount. Right now by the end game I have it at 144, but around the time you take Armour of Shadows, it will be like 30% of your stealth rating, maybe a little more, so that helps a decent amount. And then obviously you get a lot of good stats against weapon classes, but you only get these stats when you stand on an unlit tile, for which you need to deal darkness damage. Unfortunately, you might have read in some of the older guides that as long as you are in stealth, you are on an unlit tile. That is not true. Just being in stealth does not make the tile unlit, so you need some darkness damage on your gear to proc this, which is a bit painful. And honestly, sometimes when I was just swapping gear around, I just didn't have any darkness damage, and this just gave me the stealth rating, which is not ideal, but at the same time, you shouldn't be afraid to do it for a little while. This is also the reason why I went Cunning. I mean Constitution, because it scales the armor a little bit. Now this Prodigy has a requirement to deal 50,000 darkness damage, which you will not have completed by level 42, but thankfully it's very simple to do. All you need is to be in your fortress, so you need to complete Lake of Nur, and then you need to unlock this dummy room. You spawn a dummy, you get some darkness on hit damage, and you hold the button to hit the dummy, and you wait until this number gets to 50,000. It will take a while, depending on how much darkness damage on hit you have, but this is by far the easiest, safest way to farm 50,000 darkness damage. Also, speaking of this Prodigy, there is one item that makes a perfect combo with it, and that's the Duelist Heart. It gives you a lot of infravision, which is what you use in stealth. It gives you darkness damage on hit, so you don't need it anywhere else on your gear. It improves your stealth mastery by a little bit, and it has this text at the bottom that it seems to absorb light when you deal darkness damage. And what this actually means is that if you go here, you see my buffs, and then if I attack the enemy, my tile stops being lit as the other ones, and I get this Empowered by the Shadows buff that gives me 15% all damage and 10% all resistance increase, which is very nice. And you will have this up basically permanently, since you open combat usually with Venomous Throw, which will instantly unlit your tile. So this is without a doubt the perfect lantern, and I was lucky to find it. If you don't, you need the darkness on hit damage somewhere else, and at that point you might even consider taking a different defensive prodigy, like Draconic Will, or even just Ethereal Form, since this also gives you 25% all damage penetration, which is very useful. So you have options. For inscriptions, I stuck with my usual setup, Movement Inscription, as this is the best inscription in the game, Healing for cleanses and a bit of sustain, a Physical Wild against blinds and pins, a Shatter Afflictions to take care of everything else, and Rune of Dissipation, which only problem with this is that it cancels your stealth, so if you want to use it at the beginning, you have to Shadow Dance at the beginning, otherwise this will break your stealth, which means you could consider not running Rune of Dissipation, but I still think it's worth it. You will get Shadow Dance to 5 turns, which is more than enough to use Rune of Dissipation and use Fan of Knives twice, and my Torque, so it was never a problem. For the items, it is actually very different from the usual itemization, since Poison doesn't care about critical strike chance or critical multiplier, and this lets you use some of the unique items around nature damage, so this would be like Tree of Life, but this one is not particularly good for this type of build, it's more for summoners, or like Oozemancers. Eye of the Forest I seriously considered, as it gives nature resistance penetration and blindness immunity, which is very nice. Also Cunning, you are looking for Cunning on your gear, as that is one of the few extra ways you can scale apply poison, but unfortunately for Eye of the Forest, I ended up finding this helmet that gives me a ridiculous amount of resistances, and I just didn't want to get rid of it. On my neck I ended up using this amulet that gives me Dexterity Cunning, and I lucked out by getting these masteries for trapping and throwing knives, and what I really liked is that it gives me Stamina Regen, 2.4 per turn, which felt important at one point in the game, where I was running out of stamina semi-frequently, although by the end game, once you get more willpower, this is probably not as important. But this was really the only option that I had. The other neck was Choker of Dread, which I really like, but I didn't think it's as good. And what I actually used for most of the game is the Fanged Collar, which gives you 10 Cunning and a bit of resistances, and it doubles up as a sort of Blood of Life, because if you die with this amulet on, it will bite your head off and you will become a special race, a parasite, which gets its own unique race tree. You will keep your old race tree, but you won't be able to invest in it anymore, I think, and you get a new racial tree for parasite. So this was just nice as a safety net if I did ever die, and since Cunning is something really important, it even gives some decent stats. Later on though, you should swap this out. For my cloak, I ran a tier 1 cloak that gave me 70 max life for the whole game. I literally could not find a better cloak, and then in the slime tunnels right before High Peak, I dropped this Serpentine cloak, which is just perfect. This is exactly what you are looking for. 20% nature penetration, the damage mod, all the good stats, some defense even, and the masteries for the important trees. This is just beautiful. I don't hit with any mind attacks, so that part doesn't apply, but you don't need that to make this item good. The gloves I already mentioned, they just give resistance penetration for the most part, which is good enough. My belt is not great, gives me stealth rating, defense, a bit of infravision, and mostly 11 Cunning. There are not that many useful stats on belts, since you don't care about the crit multi and critical chance. Same for gloves, that's usually where you get a lot of crit multi and critical chance, and here you just don't need it. That's not entirely true, by the way. Crit multi is still useful, since your throwing knives still deal a decent amount of physical damage, and you are always critting, so it's not entirely useless, but the damage split is like 70% nature damage, 30% physical, Well, and the crit multi also works on Venomous Throw. So crit multi is not bad. Crit multi is definitely not a useless stat, but critical chance is basically useless. On the boots, it is just the Undeterred mod, a Torque of Psionic Shield. The heart is just beautiful. If you can't get that, Wintertide File is what I used before that, and it gives you the infravision you need, and it has a pretty useful effect of cleansing mind debuffs, although keep in mind this does cancel stealth. On my rings I just had to solve all my resistances, and I lucked into this Wheel of Fate that gives me 15 Cunning and 15 Dexterity, alongside a bit of stun immunity, and this on-hit melee effect that reduces damage dealt stacks with Numbing Poison, so it's not useless, it stacks and it's very good. Then I have an absolutely ridiculous rope. This might be like the best possible you can craft. It has the mod that gives tons of resistances, it has the nature mod that gives nature damage and nature resistance, and then the third mod I think gives physical damage and physical penetration, which is still a useful stat, since like I mentioned it's like 30% of your damage, so this item is just beautiful. And then we get to the weapons, which I ended up with 2 daggers, despite having a lot of options. I originally thought I would use a one-handed staff, but that is only viable if you go for the physical damage build, because you cannot tune staves to nature damage. You can to physical, but you cannot tune them to nature damage, so they are not really a valid option. On this dagger, I just rolled resistance penetration, and then one of the other mods that is pretty good is the one that just gives you tons of stats. Since everything, actually you get use out of every stat. Strength gives you some physical power, Dexterity scales your knives, Magic scales your poison. That is a really tiny benefit, but it's still some benefit. Willpower gives you stamina, Cunning scales your poison, and Constitution makes you a little tankier. So I think that's one of the better mods you can have on your weapon, since most of them are just on-hit effects that you can't use. And then for the second weapon, I ended up with Mandible of Angolmor, which I heard people say that it's ridiculously good for these type of poison builds, but it seems to only be really good if you go melee and attack with it. If you go throwing knives, this only gives you the 30% damage mod and some of the stats and poison immunity. The +5 on Toxic Death doesn't really make that much of a difference. It takes it from like 3 to like 7. It doesn't even show here on the tooltip, I guess, because it's 7 out of 5. But I was fully ready to not run this. I was using this sword for the most part, which gave 20% all resistance penetration, and that's the other good item modifier. It gives you 10% all resistance penetration, and this one rolled it twice. And that's nice because it also works for physical damage. But since I then found Serpentine Cloak that gives me the 20% nature resistance penetration, I decided to swap this out for the Mandible. Shantis the Stormblade can function as a really good leveling weapon for the part of the game where you deal physical damage, since 20 dexterity will increase the damage by a pretty big amount. So in short, nature penetration above everything else. For the Escorts, it is mostly Cunning whenever you can get it, which won't be that often, since a lot of the arcane Escorts don't give a Cunning option, but you can pick up Premonition, for example, just to get some extra resistances. And if you find a Sun Paladin, definitely take the Chant of Fortress, that gives you physical resistance. For the Alchemists, class points I found are definitely more important than generic points, and after those two you have the +3 to Dexterity and Cunning Elixir, and after that you should aim for the Elixir of Invulnerability. The basic combat pattern on this class will end up being Venomous Throw first, to apply the big slow, then you go for Fan of Knives to stack up as many debuffs as possible, and then if it's an orc, which is what you will be fighting most of the time in the late game, they will use their race ability that cleanses most of the debuffs on them. So that's where, if you are Drem, you just do it again, or if you are not Drem, you snap and do it again to get all those debuffs back, and then you can use the trap somewhere in between, and then you just spam your throwing knives until Venomous Throw comes back up, and that should finish off, hopefully, any enemy. If they are still alive at that point, it might be time to run away. Do not forget about Insidious Poison. Usually it's not that great, because with low poison investment it will reduce healing by like 30-40%, which is not even that much. But right now, my Insidious Poison reduces healing by 91%. So this is great against all the Oozemancers or the warrior classes that have the ability to regenerate a lot of health once they drop below 50% HP. Insidious Poison just ruins those kinds of enemies. So definitely keep it on your hotbar and be ready to swap into it. In conclusion, Rogue is deserving of B tier. Throwing knives are exceptional, stealth is alright, and even though I am not convinced that poison is the best choice for your primary damage, the good thing about Rogue is that there are so many options that you can build the character, from fully ranged through throwing knives, to a hybrid build, to even a fully melee rogue, and then all the supporting mechanics like the poison or the traps are all pretty decent, so you just pick and choose whatever you want, and you'll always have a competent character to play with. Next time I think it's time for some sort of caster. I've had enough of attacking for now. Thank you for watching.